Well, it's a real honor to be here tonight. I enjoyed driving over. The weather was much better than it could have been, so hopefully it won't be too bad on the way back. I like to give informal talks. I feel a little separated from the crowd up here, but I encourage you while I'm talking, if you have questions, if you want to slow me down, stop me, just throw up your hand, because I find in the summer I give a lot of tours and a lot of talks, and I enjoy it because it's a conversation. And I really enjoy dialogue and the back and forth and understanding what people in the audience are thinking about. So you can pretend we're strolling through the high country, the wildflowers are out, it's warm outside, we can pretend, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about RMBL, the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Colorado is changing. Probably most importantly, I'm going to talk about how we understand the world and why it's important. Much like GARNA, we're a nonprofit organization. Our mission in many ways is very similar. Education and outreach is an extremely important part of what we do. We go about it in a little bit different way. At the core of what we do is research. In research, I think of as a dialogue with the world. We do a lot of programs with kids, and we try to talk with kids in age-appropriate ways. Well, what is science? And I say, well, when a scientist is doing an experiment or a study, what they're doing is they're having a conversation with the world. All an experiment or a study is a question that we pose to the world, and then we have to listen carefully to what that experiment, what the world's telling us. So it's going to be a little science research focused, but at the end of the day, really what we're interested in and what we're talking about, I think, is the same thing that you're doing here through GARNA and what your mission is all about. People get confused on what field stations are. They don't look like science. There are things that do look like science, the Hubble Space Telescope, the big boats that go out and do deep sea research. Those are sequencers, so high throughput sequencing for people reading DNA. You can't quite see the telescopes up in Hawaii, but those are bright and shiny objects, and we often think of science as bright and shiny objects. And field stations, even though they're not bright and shiny, are scientific infrastructure. What they are, they're platforms for understanding that world. So if you think of the Hubble Space Telescope as something that we point to outer space to understand the universe, a field station is something that we point at our backyard in order to understand and see into that backyard. Each science has its own way of having a conversation with the world or the universe. And so it requires different kinds of equipment, different approaches. One of the things that typifies the world, and all of you in this room will appreciate this, is just how complex it is. And all this is meant to demonstrate is just how much is going on. So this is coastal sea line. You know, we've got currents out in the ocean. We've got air currents. We've got stuff moving back and forth. And the world that we live in is extremely complex. This is an example of some research. There was a student that I co-advised from Vanderbilt University, and this is just to give you a sense of that complexity. Sometimes we think of complexity as big scale, like what I just showed you with the ocean and the mountains. This is an example of very small scale complexity. So this shows an ant. As someone who studied ants, I tend to divide the world into three categories. Ants, things that eat ants, and things that ants eat. You can put almost anything into those categories in one form or another. But what this slide is showing is it's showing a mutualistic relationship between an ant and an aphid. And the ant's eating aphid poop, right? So it's good that I'm showing this after dinner rather than before. And what the ant does is it receives food, and in return, it protects that aphid. And it turns out that if you open up this relationship, there's a lot of stuff going on. And on your right, skier's right, as we would say over in Crested Butte, that's a wasp that's laying an egg inside the aphid. And that wasp larva will scoop out that aphid and kill it. It's a parasitoid. And so the reason that the aphid's attracting those ants is because it wants protection. It's like protection mafia, right? So you give them a little bit of food, and in return, they protect you. And if they get parasitized on the bottom and the middle, that's what happens to that aphid. It essentially becomes a mummy. It gets scooped out from the inside. Well, if we delve down even deeper it turns out that there's a bacteria that infects the aphid. And that bacteria, you can think of a bacteria as something that makes you sick. Well, this bacteria can protect the aphid. And there's a retrovirus. So a retrovirus is a virus that inserts itself into the DNA of the bacteria. And when that virus inserts its DNA into the bacteria produces a toxin that inhibits the growth of the parasitoid larva, right? And so if you just think of walking through a meadow and all of that complexity, and you look down at that plant and you see that little bug, you open that bug up, and it turns out that there's an amazing number of things that are going on. And so the world that we live in is incredibly complex and diverse, and it's stuff that's happening not just on large scales, but it's things that are happening that are really, really small. And to emphasize this point, and there's nothing about this figure that you need to understand or pay attention to, if you were to look at it, if I were to give you a magnifying glass, what it's showing is all the different bacteria that live in you. And it turns out the best way to think of your body as if you're a coral reef. So 10% of the cells in your body are human. I hate to break it to you, about 90% of the cells in your body are bacteria, fungi, and viruses. 1% of the genes in your body are human, right? You get to claim credit for most of the biomass. So if we count up, like and weigh stuff, that's a lot of you. But a lot of the interesting stuff, the cells and the genes, are actually not human. And so when I say you should think of your body as an ecosystem, think of yourself as a coral reef, where a coral reef is this big superstructure, and you think of all the fish swimming in and out, and those plants that are inhabiting it, inside of it. That's how your body works. And those things that are in your body, the viruses and bacteria, are not invaders, but they're things that make your body work. And if you were to pull all of those bacteria and viruses out, you would not be able to survive. And so literally, our body is an ecosystem. And there was a nice quote that I gave a talk to a healthcare group last year, and it said that healthcare scientists need to start thinking like ecologists and ecosystem biologists. We can attribute obesity, we can attribute a lot of things to disruptions in our ecosystem. So when I'm talking about diversity, it's not just the mountains and the ocean, and it's not just that plant, but it's also our body is also an ecosystem in and of itself. And so the world we live in is incredibly complex, and the tools that we need to use to study it need to reflect that diversity and that complexity. There's urgency to understanding that complexity. It's something I like to emphasize, and I think everybody understands that urgency. And this is just a simple example of the pine beetle devastation, right? So we've lost huge amounts of forest in Colorado and other places. And so there's an urgency to understanding how those ecosystems are being impacted, because if we don't understand them, we can't manage them, we can't preserve them. The idea that I'm going to sort of hang this talk on is a concept that I developed with the collaborator Mary Price, and it's called the ecology of place. And one of the things that many people get stuck on with field stations is that field stations, when they visit them, if you've had the pleasure of visiting a field station, it seems very much focused on a unique place, a backyard. So if you go over to Gothic, it can seem like the research that's being done there is just about understanding Gothic. If I were a molecular biologist, if I was a geneticist, the DNA would be the same whether I was in Zurich or Mexico City. But the backyard is different than your neighbor's backyard, right? Those places are different, they're unique. And so what we were interested in conveying is, how is it that scientists that study places which are unique in time and location, they're idiosyncratic, how is it that they get general insight around the world? And so this idea of a field station as a platform, as a telescope that looks down into the world, it's very much about how is it that we study these unique places in order to get general insight. And the way I think about it in terms of science is that a lot of times we think about general theory, the theory of evolution, general relativity if I was a physicist, and we think about data. And we think about they're just going back and forth between data and general theory. But the reality of understanding complex systems, whether it's your body or these ecosystems, is that you have to study those systems in detail. So people that want to understand how bodies work will spend a lot of time looking at individuals as case studies. And we talk in science about the study of fruit flies. So every 6 months, there's someone who's making fun of the sciences of studied fruit flies. And why are we spending so much money on the sex lives of fruit flies? But what they're doing is they're using that as a platform for understanding how everything works. And they talk about those things as model species. And the idea is that those meadows around Gothic, those high meadows up in the mountains, are model ecosystem, and by understanding them in detail and all their beauty and diversity, they provide a platform for understanding the whole world. So Gothic, it's the site of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. How many people have been to Gothic? How many people have spent a summer in Gothic? I know Ken has and Paul has, a couple people. So there are very few places that I give a talk where we don't have RMBL alumni in the room. So most of you probably know where we're located. That's Highway 50 that runs through the middle there, and we're just north of Highway 50. And if you think about it, and you're trying to find a place in central Colorado that was about as far removed from highways and any place else as you could get, that's where you would end up. RMBL was founded, Paul was off only by 2 years. It was founded in 1928, John Johnson on the right. And if you come over to Gothic, I'll give you the story of Rumble's founding. I promise to keep this relatively short, so I'm not going to go into it, but I will give you a teaser. So most field stations in the world are associated with the college university. So Stanford University has Jasper Ridge. Kansas State has a long-term ecological research site where they do prairie research. RMBL is unique in that we're our own nonprofit. We're own 501c3. And even though John Johnson had started out as a faculty member at Western State, some politics involving the Ku Klux Klan ended up to Rumble being founded as an independent field station. So that's the teaser, and if you want to know the link, you're going to have to come over for one of our tours in the summer. And Gothic, before I move on the slides, Gothic is one of the old mining towns that are scattered across Colorado, and that photo is from the 1930s. Gothic boomed in 1879. They had a silver discovery, the Sylvanite mine. That was a very productive mine, but the silver market bottomed out in the 1880s, 1890s. We went off the silver standard, so the value really dropped. So by the 20s, when John Johnson was looking to set up a field station, there was this old abandoned mining town, and the biologists moved in and took over in 1928, and we've been there ever since. This is we call it the town hall. John Johnson, the founder, was a fairly conservative fellow, and so he led a campaign to convince everybody that the building, which is the main building that you see when you came in, was actually a very respectable building. And many alumni will come back and say, I just want you to know that it wasn't a respectable building, it was a saloon. We renovated the building with some funds from the State Historical Fund, and there were a lot of architectural details that suggested the upstairs was being operated as a brothel. And so it's not a the history. We call it the town hall, but, and this shows John Johnson with his family. It's always been a very family-oriented place. He had 4 kids. His first wife, who is one of the co-founders of RMBL, unfortunately passed away after 3 or 4 years, and he was raising 4 children on his own. And by this time, he had taken a position back east at a school because he was no longer affiliated with Western State. And the story goes is the first summer that he had to drive out to Gothic by himself with 4 children, and this is in the early 30s, so you can imagine driving from Pennsylvania to Gothic in the summer with 4 little boys. And the vehicles didn't have the same safety features that they have today, so they say that he had a very elaborate system that involved having the boys tied up so that he could kind of control them so that they couldn't pop open the doors or windows as they drove across. So apparently after one summer in Gothic, as a single father, he decided that he couldn't keep going with that. So he went back and told the dean of students at the school that he needed a wife, and she agreed. Hopefully there's more to the story, but those details haven't passed down. This is what Gothic looks like today, more or less. Well, not today. It looks a little wider today. But the town hall is actually there in the center of the picture. That was the building that we were looking at, sort of full on. And most of the buildings, or all of the buildings, are owned by RMBL at this point. We manage 70 buildings, 45,000 square feet of space. Most of the buildings are used to house scientists. It's a residential campus. One of the unique things is that it provides an immersive experience for students who come to take summer's worth of research and courses. At the bottom, on the top, that's Gothic Mountain in the background. Gothic got its name because of the big buttresses. It reminded people of Gothic cathedrals in Europe. And it was photographed and really described in the European literature in the Hayden Survey when they went through in the 1870s. There at the bottom is a building we built several years ago. That's a stimulus project. It was probably one of the few shovel-ready projects that was actually funded through the stimulus package, but that's the Gothic Research Center that was built and opened several years ago that allows us to integrate genomic techniques, a lot of clean techniques with field research. We're starting to put more and more sensors out. So this is a weather station that we've operated since the early 1990s. That is a weather station that we manage for the Environmental Protection Agency, and it provides insights into the acidity of water. It's part of a national network. One of the things that's changed in science in the last 10 years is the explosion in what we can measure. So there's amazing technology that you can put out and understand what's going on in the world. Examples that continue to sort of blow me away what scientists can do. We had some scientists that were taking tree rings, so they're putting cores into trees and pulling those tree rings out. And we have some trees on the upper slopes that are 1,000 years old. So they're isolated because they've got rock scree all around them. So when you get that 200-year fire go through, they're relatively protected. Well, the scientists can extract water from each of those tree rings, and the isotopic signature of water that comes in snow is different than the isotopic signature of water that comes in rain. And so they can actually go back the last 1,000 years and talk about how the amount of moisture we're getting in the high country and rain versus water has changed. Just as an example of the kind of things that scientists can measure these days. So I started off with one of my early slides showing these bright, shiny objects and saying that's scientific infrastructure, and RMBL is scientific infrastructure, and it looks a little different. And this is our scientific infrastructure. So these are scientists that come from all over the world, and they come to us and they use us as a platform to conduct research on lots of different things. And I talked about how complex the world is, and what we do, maybe the value we bring is we allow the scientists to weave together all of the different stories that they have. And so individually, we have scientists that have watched the same piece of ground for 40 years in order to understand how flowering has changed. We've had scientists spend 50 years looking at marmots. It's a little bit like the Old Testament. This marmot begat that marmot for generation upon generation. And so individually, they have these fascinating stories. But in order to understand the complex world that we live in, RMBL creates the opportunity to weave those individual stories together. So we take these beautiful strands and we end up with a tapestry of understanding. So that's our scientific infrastructure, are all of those minds and eyes that are out there looking at the world. An important part of what we do, very similar to what GARNA does, is that we help students learn how to see the world and engage with the world. And so when people started coming out to RMBL back in the 70s, as one of your members did in the late 60s, at that time, the way that children and young adults were introduced to the world was very different. Chances were that people had spent time on farms, they'd spent time outside, and when they came to RMBL, they knew how to make a fire, they knew how to go hiking, they might not have had a lot of science classes, but they had a lot of time outside. And so what we were doing 50 years ago was really helping them take that outdoor experience and translate it into science. What we're finding more and more is that kids show up and they've had great science education. We have a long way to go in our country in terms of improving science education, but we do a pretty good job. It's pretty amazing what the kids get in schools these days. But a lot of times, they don't have that outdoor experience, kind of what Maggie was talking about in her talk. And so field stations and organizations like GARNA, I think, are critically important to introducing kids to the outdoors, because these are not opportunities that they're getting on their own. We've had students, and we really, we do a lot with younger kids, but our historical focus has been on undergraduates. And we've had undergraduates, I like to help the students move in when they show up. We had a student, 20 years old, who had never been out of inner city LA until she flew from LA to Denver and then took the flight from Denver to Gunnison, and then we drove her up to the field station, right? So that was really her first opportunity. So I think it's incredibly important that kids have organizations like GARNA and Rumble to introduce them to the outdoors. And, you know, and what an introduction, right? I mean, so when you're working in RMBL, which is located about 9,300 feet in elevation, you get to take them into just beautiful habitats. The circle trip is a trip that, you know, the botany class, Paul Buck and Harriet Barkley, some of the old professors used to do there at Rumble. They'd get them over to the Black Canyon, they'd get them down to Gunnison. There's an incredible diversity of habitats that you get here in Colorado just by moving up and down the elevation. And so that's one of the amazing things about being able to educate kids to the outdoors here, is you can expose them to so much in such a short area because of our elevational gradient. So I'm going to just run through quickly just a little bit about what we're seeing about how the Colorado high country is changing. That's Billy Barr. He's our local hermit. He grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, moved to Gothic in 1973 and decided he was never going to leave. He was featured in Men's Journal, if you can believe that, just a couple weeks ago. So if you want to read a little bit more about Billy and some of his research, not that I expect Men's Journal is a high-selling magazine in this crowd, but they do have kind of a nice write-up. He's been tracking when the snow melts the last 40, 45 years, and it turns out snowmelt date is a really important driver for these high mountain ecosystems. So we can have the snow melt off in the high country in early April, and it can also melt out in mid-June. And when it melts out, it has a big impact on that ecosystem. And there's a lot of variability, and some of you can probably find some of your favorite years, depending upon whether you like to ski or mountain bike. But what we see is a general decrease in when snow's melting out. So snow's melting out, on average, a little bit earlier than it used to. One of the big drivers of snowmelt, and a lot of times people think about climate change, but that earlier snowmelt date is not being driven entirely by climate change, but that's dust on snow. So that's not a bad projector or a dirty slide. That's the valleys up above Crested Butte, and that dark that you see on snow is actually a dust event that deposited a lot of dust out of the Four Corners area. I think that event might have actually come from Tucson. Chris Landry has done a lot of work on this. And that dust changes the color of the snow. And for those of you who think about, you're probably aware that if you wear a dark shirt, it absorbs more heat. White reflects it. And so when you get that kind of dust deposition on snow, you're changing how much heat is being absorbed. And so it can have a dramatic impact on snowmelt date. And that's probably driven on changes in land use patterns. So more off-road vehicles, the breakdown of cryptogamic soil. So when we get big storm events, that dust is more likely to lift up and deposit. So that's actually one of the bigger changes that's happening. And that snowpack, it's like a reservoir, a dam that we didn't have to pay anything for, right? So that snowpack holds moisture until we're ready for it to irrigate our hay meadows, to drink in many areas. And so when we change that snowpack, we're actually changing when water's released and disrupting a lot of the water flows in Colorado. So that's one of the big changes. This is a Nature Conservancy slide, and the color doesn't show up so well, but the big graph on the right, what this shows is you go from January to December, and it shows that the Blue Mesa, which is that big reservoir just west of Gunnison, that from 1950 to 2000, we would see peak runoff show up in late May, early June, and now it's changing over a month, so that the modelers are projecting that peak runoff will be about a month earlier in the next 50 years than it was during that 50-year period. And a month is a pretty big change. You know, I grew up in Kansas, and it seemed like summer went on forever, but the Colorado high country might be snow-free from early June, or at least historically early June, until October. And so you add a month to that, and that can be a pretty big change in how long your growing season is. Marmot hibernation is about 38 days earlier than it used to be, so the marmots are coming up earlier from snow. The American robins are arriving about 2 weeks earlier. This was research that was published back in 2000, so we're almost 15 years later. Probably should update those numbers. But these organisms, these species like the marmots and the American robins, are actually very sensitive indicators of how the world's changing. We see bees moving up in elevation. So Graham Pike, who's on your left, was a student out at RMBL in the late 70s, and he did a lot of bee survey work. We have in those valleys native bees, a little unusual for the United States. Most of the bees that you see in the United States are the introduced honeybee, but they don't do well up at high elevations because of cold temperatures. So we have a very wonderful, diverse bombus bumblebee community. He did some surveys in the 1970s, spent his career at a museum in Australia, and then came back in the early 2000s and repeated the surveys. And we've seen that bee species are moving up about 100 meters in elevation. Approximately 1/3 of the calories that humans eat come from plants which are pollinated by insects or animals. We have a lot of pollination biology that goes on at RMBL. Largely because we have those native bee communities, we've always attracted people from all over the world. And sometimes it seems like kind of a little esoteric thing, you know, why do people care? And so I bring this out. And it's not just 1/3 of any calories, it's 1/3 of the stuff you like to eat, right? It's not the oats, it's not the, it's not the corn, it's the fruits, coffee, if you're addicted to coffee, those kind of things exist because they're pollinated by insects. So these changes in pollinator communities can have big implications for food supplies. One of the stories, and this is an example I use a lot, and I talked about this challenge of why is it that studying the outdoors in these areas, why is it that it matters to everybody else? And it's something I had to think a lot about, because after the 2009 stimulus package, the Sean Hannity show picked up on a report done by John McCain and Bill Coburn, 2 senators, and they called it the pork stimulus package. So they had 100 projects that were funded through the stimulus package, and David Inouye, I think, was number 52. So the Sean Hannity show decided to show up and interview me about why the American government is wasting money by spending money on these kind of studies. I think they assumed that there was some senator's cousin that lived in Gothic, and that's why we're sending all this money there. So David Inouye is the scientist who's sitting there in that meadow of aspen sunflowers. And when I'm showing on the top, you can see Gothic Mountain in the background. And those photographs were taken on the same day in 2 different years. And the difference is that one has a lot of yellow and the other doesn't. And the yellow that you see in one photo is the aspen sunflower, which is an iconic wildflower that you see in Colorado's high country. And it turns out that the aspen sunflower has not done well in the last 20 years. And David Inouye was an undergraduate from Swarthmore University who came out to Rumble. He's currently the president of the Ecological Society of America, a distinguished professor at the University of Maryland. And he has about 25 plots around Gothic that he visits 2 or 3 times a week, and he's done that since 1973. And so he has millions of observations on what's flowering and when things are flowering. And what they've seen, and it's a little counterintuitive, is that with earlier snowmelt, the wildflowers are more susceptible to frost events. So the frost events are coming in about the same time, but the plants are starting to grow earlier. And so they're further along, and they're more likely to be in this vulnerable stage, the flower stage, when the frost event hits. And for those of you that have struggled to get peaches out of western Colorado or cherries and have noticed that there have been a number of years where there's not a lot of fruit, it's because the same thing's going on. And ironically, when I did that interview with the Sean Hannity show, we were paying through the nose for orange juice because frost events were hitting Florida. And so this is an example. There aren't many agricultural systems where we have 40, 50 years of long-term data where we can piece together why it is that we're not seeing the same kind of productivity that we used to. David Inouye's work on the aspen sunflower, even though it's not an agricultural system where people are monetizing it, it can provide insight into what's going on with our agricultural systems as the world changes. So I mentioned the bees are moving up in elevation. Same true with mosquitoes. We had a scientist, and I'm sure at that time the parents like, why are you spending a summer in Gothic studying what? Especially in order to key out mosquitoes, you have to focus in on mosquito genitalia. So it's, you know, you can just imagine this poor student trying to explain to their parents what they're trying to do. Courtney Murdoch followed up on that. So she got her PhD at the University of Michigan, and she repeated those surveys about 30 years later. And what she found was that the mosquito species, not surprisingly, have moved up in elevation. Mosquitoes are important because they're a vector for a lot of diseases that have impacts on humans and large mammals. And so understanding how disease is going to change in the United States requires understanding how these distributions are changing. And Courtney's work is an example of another amazing set of tools. She would go out, she would collect mosquitoes, and the way you collect mosquitoes is you put CO2 emitters out, because mosquitoes look for carbon dioxide emissions. So if you want to get rid of mosquitoes, if you're out in nature and they're bothering you, just hold your breath for a really long time and it'll take care of the problem. So she would put carbon dioxide emitters, and she could catch mosquitoes which had fed, so they had blood, and then she could take the blood, do PCR, polymerase chain reaction, and she could figure out what species they'd been feeding on, and she could figure out what diseases were moving between those species. And simply by collecting those mosquitoes, she could reconstruct this web of disease transmission. Just, to me, fascinating what scientists are doing. This is an iconic experiment that's been run since the early 90s. Those are warming chambers. RMBL's greatest contribution to carbon dioxide emissions, having done our sustainability study, is this global warming experiment that we're running. So they've been heating the outdoors about 3 degrees warmer than the control plots. And one of the facts that you'll hear about is that they're predicting that Colorado's high country will see the loss of some of the showy wildflowers and see an increase in the woody sage species. And that's based upon this study that's been going on for 25 years at this point. The marmot study that I alluded to earlier, Dan Bloomstein, who's chair of the Ecology and Evolutionary and Behavior Department at UCLA, he took over a study that was started by Ken Armitage, University of Kansas, where Paul did his graduate work. Ken started working out at Rumble, watching those marmots in the early 1960s, and then Dan took it over about 15 years ago. And so they've got millions of observations on marmots. Last year, the scientists were complaining about how slow our internet was, common complaint up there. And I was talking to one of his students, and I said, well, you know, what is it that you're sending back and forth? And she's like, oh, I've got the whole RNA profile. She's trying to send like gigs of data byte overnight, because what they'll do is they have all these behavioral observations on the marmots, but then they can take blood samples and look at what proteins are actually being expressed and match those up with their behavior patterns. And so they can make a link between the genes and the proteins that those genes make with what the marmots are actually doing in the field. And then Dan, like many of our scientists, are very generous with their time. And I think this photo might have been taken, we had an unfortunate incident where we have a very healthy fox population, and we had a group of younger kids observe predation in action. It traumatized some of the kids, but that's nature, red in tooth and claw. And the marmots, we thought we need to brand a beer called Stout Marmot or something like that. But they were able to use this long-term data and look at what's going on with the marmots. Rumble is not a place where we say climate change is happening. We use ice cores, we use coral reefs to reconstruct thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. The marmot data is, I think, the world's longest running mark recapture study of a non-game animal. In 50 years, 60 years, it's pretty impressive, but it's not the 10,000 or 100,000 record that you need to say, hey, humans are causing climate change. But what we do that isn't really done anywhere else is we can understand whether the biological responses with the animals and plants, the changes that we're seeing are consistent with climate change. And so they delved into the fact that the marmots are coming out of hibernation earlier, what that means for their bodies, what that means for their population numbers. And then an example, I'm going to sort of close, I'll have a few more slides, but to close up the biology part, this is Ward Watt, who started working out at Rumble, I think in 1963, as an undergraduate from Yale, spent most of his career at Stanford University and just moved in his early 70s to start another research program at the University of South Carolina. And he's been working on butterflies, which seems like, well, that's cute. It's great that the scientists have something to do in the summer. But those butterflies are a model system for understanding how genes work. So if you were taking genetics and they were teaching it today as an undergraduate or even a graduate student, chances are you'd probably be reading about the butterflies up in Gothic. And he's been able to figure out why butterflies do well or not so well at different temperatures. And they figured out there's a gene, so the color doesn't show up well, but he studies coleus butterflies, which are the yellow butterflies. If you look out here in the summer, you'll see these coleus butterflies, and some of them are white, and some of them are yellow. There's variation within that species, and they know what gene causes the difference in color variation, and if the gene doesn't get used to produce yellow, that gene gets caught up in different pathways and affects the range of temperatures over which those butterflies can fly. And you read a lot about the global climate model, which is what we use to predict what temperature will be like in 50 years. They have regional climate models that can make predictions for areas like over the greater Arkansas River area. And they're able to link those predictions for the regional climate models with what's going on with the butterflies, and not only predict how the butterfly ranges will change just based upon the current population dynamics, but how those butterfly populations will evolve because they understand the genetics well enough and how the evolution will change with temperature. So another example of how the scientists are using some really amazing tools to understand and predict what's going to go on with butterflies, wildflowers, and marmots. I like to emphasize that the research that's done is something that directly impacts lives. It's science that matters. This is the Mexican Cut. It's a nature preserve. It was the Nature Conservancy's first project in the state of Colorado that they did in collaboration with Rumble. And there was research. Again, you can see, I can see the student trying to explain to their parents, what is it that you're doing in the summer? You're counting salamanders? But that study led to interest in the biogeochemistry of those ponds, and what they were seeing in the late 80s and early 90s was this acidic pulse. So when the snowpack would melt, all of that water would flush through those ponds, and the acidity would drop down below 5, which is actually very acidic. And they realized it was due to emissions from a power plant down in the Four Corners area. So they're able to link that. And Tim Wirth at that time was a US Senator. He was on our board of trustees. And the first Bush administration was revising the Clean Air Act. And they used that science to include provisions in the revision of the Clean Air Act, bipartisan legislation. And there are provisions to protect air in the western US because of that research. We'd known that acid rain was a big problem in the Northeast, but this provided evidence that convinced Congress in a bipartisan manner. They didn't shut down the plant, but what they did was they required that plant to scrub the air before they released it. So that's an example of how science and how research can lead to dramatic changes. And so it's literally true when I say that the air we breathe is cleaner because of research that was done at RMBL. We have non-consumptive water rights in the state of Colorado. So if you enjoy the fishing rights, Trout Unlimited, or kayaking, they have recreational rights. Those were established, non-consumptive water rights were established by RMBL because the streams were considered critical for our research. So we filed for those water rights, and then the Colorado State Supreme Court upheld those rights, and that led to the legislation that established non-consumptive water rights in Colorado. So our air, our water, as one of our supporters say, well, who should care about RMBL? And he says, if you drink water, if you breathe air, if you eat food, you should care about the science that's being done. Looks like I lost a little bit of this slide. One of the things I'm going to close on, just to emphasize this is a controversial paper, but economists can quibble about the details, but the overall message is right. What they showed was, what you can't read there on the right, is the global, at that time, late 1990s, the global, so the world's economic output was about 18 trillion. The economist estimated that the ecosystem services, the economic value of the world around us was almost twice the value of our traditional economic systems, right? That's pollination. I mentioned 1/3 of the food that humans eat comes from plants which are pollinated by insects and animals. That's water, that's habitat, that's climate regulation. So the quality of our lives, and not just the quality of our lives, but our economic systems. Anybody who cares about the vitality of our economic systems has to care about what's going on in the environment, because the environment is critical to how the world works. Don't have to preach to this audience, right? It's something you all understand. And I want to tie this in with this is a graph I pulled out of the New York Times. And what it shows is the percentage of students that were in school in 1900, and then the economic growth of the country 100 years later. In other words, if a country like the United States, it's up in the upper right, had a lot of kids in school in 1900, it was a very vital, vibrant economy 100 years later. And the analogy I want to draw is that I think the same is true with the environment. And so if we come back in 2100 or 2200 and we look at countries and we look at communities that have invested in environmental education and environmental science, the ones that will be vital, the ones that we'll enjoy living in, the ones that we'll be proud of, will be those institutions, those communities, and those countries that invested in environmental education. And I think it's a no-brainer, because if you go back to that slide that says much of our economic activity and economic value comes from the environment, unless we invest in that knowledge and that understanding and that education, we're not going to have the knowledge we need in order to maintain that economic vitality. And so I just like to close on that to make the link, because what you do and what you support through the the Greater Arkansas River Nature Association is incredibly important. And I hope I'm sure it's something that you enjoy just getting out the door, but it's not just something that leads to pleasure for you, it's something that will determine the quality of lives for your children and grandchildren. And so when Paul and Maggie and some of the other people stand up and say, support GARNA, do it. Not only because you enjoy it, but do it because it's incredibly important for the kids and grandkids that'll come after. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me tonight.